My dear friend Wilka Roig is the founder and president of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation in Central Mexico. She's the Deputy Director of Education of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation Global and co-founder of Red Latinoamericana de Acompañamiento en la Muerte y el Duelo. A psychologist, Wilka is also a grief counselor, a consultant, an educator, a facilitator certified in degriefing integrative grief therapy. An ordained interfaith minister, her professional interests include the neurobiology of trauma, loss, and grief. As Wilka says, grief is a human condition. The human organism is in a constant state of becoming, and every second something is born and something dies within us. We are no longer the same person we were a moment ago. The dance of becoming consists of letting go of everything that creates obstacles to this natural process. And each of us knows grief is a deeply personal thing, and no two people grieve in exactly the same way. Wilka helped me through a period of great grief, and I hope you will discover in her presentation a softness to salve your soul. Please help me welcome Wilka Roig to our beloved community.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to see how to make this work. Let's see. Is that good? Excellent. Well, thank you all for having me here, and I am very honored to be sharing with you today. So the first thing I will say is that what I say, which is none of what I say comes from me, but it comes from the learning through accompanying people through their grief and their dying, preparing for death, or wanting to contemplate their mortality and be more intimate with the fact that we are all going to die. And so, but what I say, based on what I've learned from these people who have trusted me with supporting them, is that grief is the human condition. So it's not that it's a, but the, and I'll explain. I will tell you first, well, I'll start with for me, the three fundamental truths from this work that I do and that I offer to you that I've learned from the dying and the grieving. The first one is that life is made up of losses, that we survive these losses and go through the process of transforming into who we are becoming, and that process is grief. And that we are all going to die, but that's not the short of it. It really is that we all have the opportunity to be of service to humanity through our dying. And I can only tell you this because I have seen it over and over with dying people, that we leave something of value behind when we move on, right? So we leave the body, but we leave something with those who remain, and that is the work of evolution. And so I'm going to just share with you a few points about why life is, and all it is constantly going through loss, right? So even when we think that we want to stay the same and be the same, and we sort of attached to this idea of just the one person we are actually constantly in a state of transformation. We are constantly in a state of transition. We are changing. Everything around us is changing. And so for change to occur, something can no longer be. And so what that means is that we are going through losses, because that which can no longer be is a loss, right? And then from there, we move into that space of, well, who am I now? What is going on with my life? I knew my life to be this, and now it can no longer be this. Something has changed. Something in me has changed. Something around me has changed. Anything as simple as losing your keys or your glasses or your phone puts us in a position of loss and having to reconsider who we have been, who we are, and who do we wish to become. Right? We don't want to lose our keys anymore, or whatever it is. So from the smallest loss, right, to the biggest loss, we are constantly going through the possibility of practicing our grieving. So we change, and then we go through this process of not knowing who we are, questioning what our life was like before, why it can no longer be the same, but then we still don't know who will we be after. Will we survive this change? Will we be able to live without our phone, right? So in the same way, we have small losses and we have big losses. And so that process of, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I belong, I don't know where to go from here, all of that is the process that allows us to go into the cocoon of who we are becoming, right? This is the space of gestation. It is the space of darkness. It is that underground where the seed is planted. It is that womb where new life will come, right? That is the process of grief. So the way we've been told about it, and we've all been conditioned for too many centuries now, in a sort of away from our nature and away from the fact that we are nature, that because we are nature, we go through cycles of life and death and life and regeneration and rebirth constantly. It's not just the trees that do it. You know, it's not just the land that does it. We do it. And that is what today we call grief. But because we're so disconnected from this unfamiliar place, the underground of the earth or the womb, then we forget. So a big part of what our grief process invites us to do is to remember that we are also that, and that we were born of the unknown, the mystery, and that we move through life in the unknown and the mystery, and that death is just the magnus piece, you know, the magnanimous piece of our life. It's the ultimate transformation. So, the process of grief is that time that invites a pause. I can no longer be who I was before. I need to pause. I need to rest. I need to let my body tell me. I need to let my mind disconnect from what things were so that new things can generate, so I can connect in new ways. It requires that time of incubation. What happens today is that our society doesn't give us the time to pause. For the most part, we have been conditioned to be busy, to be productive, to keep going, to be strong, to let them rest, to not cry, whatever it is. And so we are not allowing ourselves the space we need. And a big part of what we're also missing is the community to hold that with us, right? So a big invitation right now is to say, we are all grieving. Whether we are grieving a change in our surroundings, in the condition of our life, in the condition of our bodies, in our relationships, in our roles in life, there are ways in which we are all grieving those changes. When we think about the fact that when we go through change, we have to go through that space of transformation, right? So we think of grief as only one definition, right? Which is, you know, somebody died and now, you know, I miss them so much I can't go on with my life. But that's not all that grief is. It is that, but it's so much more than that. And so if we think about the fact that each one of us is going through a transition right now, each one of us has gone through some kind of loss that either happened very recently or happened many, many years ago, but that we're still carrying, we can shift our way of recognizing one another, as in what was read earlier, right? This is how we are together. This is what connects us, that we are all in that process of constant transformation. And if we remember that, we want to honor it for ourselves, but we also then are inspired to honor it for others. Can you imagine what kind of community we could have if we met every person as, you're grieving, I'm grieving, you're going to die, I'm going to die. This may be the last time that we have an opportunity to be connected in this way. How different would our lives be, right? Okay, so the service that we do in our dying. We are constantly dying. It's just that today we assume that death is only that final death of the body. But we are constantly in a process of dying. Our cells are constantly multiplying and dividing. Some cells are dying and some cells are regenerating. This is happening in our bodies right now. There are parts of us that are dying because our life is changing, our conditions are changing, as we said. But in every one of those, when we bring awareness and we connect with what it teaches us, then we are doing a service to the rest of humanity, believe it or not. And we can talk more about that later. But our dying is really also an opportunity that we are, most of us, missing out on, because we've been told that only the specialists are the ones who are allowed to handle our dying. But before all of that, we handled our dying in community. And we all got an opportunity to learn more about what our capacity is, what our strength is, what our potential is. We learn only in holding the space for the dying and the grieving that we have greater capacity for patience, something that in general is not fomented in this current society, for compassion, for love, for kindness, for caring. And the dying have so much to teach us. It is only at that end of lifetime that some get the chance to connect with this wisdom that then they can give and hand to those who stay behind. So I also invite you to think about how we can begin to hold that space together as in a community, rather than thinking that we have to die alone, that we have to grieve alone, and that we don't want to have anything to do with somebody else's grief or loss. It is not a tragedy. It is essential to who we are becoming, not just as individuals, but as a collective. So the second truth for me, lesson from the dying and the grieving, is that, I need to connect with myself for a second. Yes, this is just a reminder for all of us when we're talking about death, the only cause of death is that life was conceived in form. Okay, I'll say that again. The only cause of death is that life was conceived in form. The moment there is life in form, there is the possibility of death. Life and death are born at the same time. Therefore, life and death are also born when we die. It is something that we work with, live with, are infused with every moment of every day and every night, every breath. So we think about, oh, what did this person die of? And then we think, oh, well, maybe I won't die of that and I can avoid it. This is all a fantasy, an illusion, right? We all die because life was conceived in form. And the moment the form is no longer viable or sustainable life, then it's going to enter into its dying process. And this could be that a life is not sustainable in a form that is physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually no longer viable. Which then leads us to know that every death is honorable, and every death is completely valid and true and right. So how we die is only a reflection of the trajectory of our life and the conditions that contained this organism. So when we shift our perspective, and you have to tell me about the time because I'm going to... when we shift our perspective to understand that this is inherent in our experience every single day, a lot of things shift. Because we're no longer spending our energy trying to avoid life because we are trying to avoid death. If we avoid death, we're avoiding life. These two are connected together, right? So then we stop spending our time resisting the ultimate truth that is this, and then we begin to engage with who we are as life, because that's what we are. We're manifestations of life and death. And the final truth that I want to share with you is this. Again, grief is the human condition. So if we begin to accept this, then we begin to understand that this is all that we are here to go through. We keep thinking that we have to get over it, move on, get on with our life. That's not possible unless we go through the process of healing through the grief. So this is the thing. Grief comes to teach us how we are to evolve. So this is the invitation to you as well. When you have these moments, oh, by the way, it's not just an emotion. Grief is a whole person experience. right? It includes emotions, it includes how your brain is working, how your heart is feeling, all of these things, how your body's responding. But when we feel the grief in the way that it shows up for you, it is telling you your growth curriculum. When you feel that you miss something or someone so much, sit with that and then think about what are the qualities of that which you miss, because those are the qualities that are now planted in you so that you can cultivate them in yourself and through around your life, right? We are left with big homework when we go through a loss. So it's an active engagement with life when we feel like a part of us has died, and it has, right? So a part of us has died, we feel like we can no longer go, but then it is through the grief does us this big, huge favor, which is to let us know, what am I missing? What am I needing? What needs to change? What can I now include? How can I enrich the life that exists through me? We all have a responsibility to that. And so we've been sort of, I think, guided a little bit skewed from what we can do. There's a lot that we can no longer do, but there's a lot that we can do. But we also can't do this alone. We do it in community. So the other thing is that we need to begin to practice holding space for each other so that we can tell our stories, not so we can change how anyone feels or thinks or what happened or anything like that. None of this is a problem. Our nature is not a problem. Our dying is not a problem. Our grieving is not a problem. So it doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be tended to. It needs to be held and embraced. So to hold space and learn from each other's stories. Sometimes we're afraid, we want to hear about somebody's loss anymore. If you feel so called, give it a try. Be present with someone else. Don't interrupt them. Don't ask questions. Just let them share. And you'll see how many lessons are there for you. We need more of these circles of just storytelling without interruption, without introjection, without, all of these things that we do in our, regular social interactions. So, I don't know how we're doing with time. Time? Keep going? Okay. Okay, so here's another thing. If we notice, the reason why we now have these sort of scripts and patterns of response or reaction around each other when we are grieving, going through losses, or there's somebody dying or somebody who's just died, all of it is a strategy to keep us from feeling our discomfort. We're not willing to be uncomfortable, right? So an invitation from grief, from loss, from death, from the fact that we are both life and death existing simultaneously, is, can I just befriend the fact that to be human and to be in these bodies is uncomfortable? That having emotional reactions is uncomfortable because we've given it that name. What if we change the language? It is part of our experience in these bodies and with each other. But we've been so conditioned that we don't want to be uncomfortable, that we don't want to feel any pain, that the first sign of pain, take something so you don't feel anything. So what are we doing? We're numbing ourselves. Pain comes for a reason. Discomfort comes for a reason, right? If you're uncomfortable and you're like, okay, this chair is kind of hard, it's telling you get something different so that you can adapt, right? It's the same with the discomfort of holding space for somebody's loss, for holding space for somebody's emotional response. It's an invitation. It's because we think that loss is inconvenient, that death is inconvenient, that grief is inconvenient, but it is actually it is the essential component to who we are constantly becoming. And I think, I don't know if that's enough time. I might have sped through it. What? Well, those are the 3 points. I have many points. I could tell you so many things. I do. Does anyone have a question that you'd want to prompt for me? Yeah.
I get the idea that you're possibly talking about a death which has been, which is like a natural death. What about horrible accidents?
Yes.
Sudden death which is not expected, and the death of children.
Yes. Okay, great question. So she's asking about what about the deaths that are sudden, unexpected, or the death of children, right? So as I mentioned, you know, the only cause of death is that life was conceived in form, right? So it's very valid that any form at any time in its existence will cease and die, right? So the death of children is just as natural and just as acceptable as suicide, accidents, any kind of dying. This is a whole other conversation. But I'll tell you what, children are the wisest because they have not been conditioned as we have. They have not been sort of, what is it when you get a lot of layers of stuff on top of you, burdened with all of these fears, assumptions, vocabulary that is suggestive vocabulary about what dying is, all of these things. So they are the greatest teachers, not just in their own dying. They're the most, I would say, illuminated in their own process of dying, but also in the process of holding space for death and holding space for grief. So we need to include our children in the community that holds. They have great sort of pure wisdom to share with us. And in the case of accidental and other kinds of deaths such as this, there is a way in which, from my observation of, I don't know how many years anymore of what I've been doing this work, is that there is a way in which we unconsciously prepare for a death, even if we don't know it's coming. And I only say this as a fact because I've seen it way too many times to say that it's not true. But we can make it conscious. Right? A lot of the reason why we suffer so much at the end of life is because we've not been dying consciously through all of our losses in life. So then all of the work, all of the lessons, all of the unfinished business, all of that accumulates at the very end and is very overwhelming, right? So if we were doing this work consciously and intentionally and gracefully throughout life, then we would be able to reclaim our nature to die gracefully, to die easefully, and all of this. But always there will be deaths that are sudden, that are unexpected, because that's just part of life. You know, I hope that's helpful. And I guess with that, it's an arbitrary close, and we will talk a little bit more later after the service. Thank you.